Good evening, everyone. My name is Kowalski Salter. I'm the Executive Director of the First Division Museum, and we would like to welcome you to our Date with History. This is the first of two Date with Histories that we have this month. And so for those of you who have attended our Date with Histories in the past, where we had those up close and personal at Cantini Park, this follows the same format. We will have our guest speaker who will talk to us up until about 7:40, 7:45, and we'll use the last 15 minutes for the Q&A. And the way you ask your question is, first of all, go to the the button feature at the bottom of your computer, and that's where you will place your question into the queue. Please do not use the hand raising feature. And my teammate, Laura Sears, who is with us tonight, she will get to as many questions as possible and get those to David so we can have a very lively discussion in this virtual environment.
We already have a few questions, so we're already getting questions in. So know that we see your questions, they will be answered at the end. And thank you for using the Q&A feature.
Okay, outstanding. And so the last two things I would like to say before I introduce our speaker is we have been very fortunate. This is probably our 7th or 8th virtual program, Date with History and military trivia night. And we have not had any technical difficulties, and we're not going to have any tonight. But if we do, just please forgive us. And we will drive on. The last thing I want to do is say a great welcome to our teachers from Illinois who have logged in and joined our professional development credit program. And if you have not joined and you are one of the teachers in Illinois, please email Laura on this Zoom email, and she will make sure that you get signed up for the professional development, because our next Date with History is 2 weeks from tonight, and our very next one is 4 weeks from tonight. So one of the positives for us in this virtual environment is we have almost doubled our capacity of doing great Date with Histories like the one we're going to have tonight. So this is where I go to my notes and read to you so I can make sure I get everything about our guest speaker tonight. So David Chrisinger is the author of the forthcoming book about Ernie Pyle's wartime experiences, entitled The Unhappy Warrior, Ernie Pyle and the Story of the Second World War. He is also a contributing writer to the New York Times At War column and The War Horse, where his reporting focuses on the intersections of conflict, trauma, and the stories that we tell about ourselves. In addition, he directs the writing program at the University of Chicago's Harris School of Public Policy and teaches memoir writing to military veterans and their family. And an added addition, for those of you who would like to keep up with David's journey as he traces the footsteps of Ernie Pyle throughout the war, please go to his website. It is simply hisname.com and ask for, an email invite so you can follow him. And David, I will tell you, when we booked you a while ago, I spent about 5 minutes on your website. Then yesterday, I spent 10 minutes on your website. And this afternoon, I spent 35 minutes on your website. So I will tell everyone to go to David's website. It is awesome, a lot of great information. I have already tagged one article to go back and read, and actually printed one article that I will read tomorrow, and I'm really excited about it. So David, we are pleased to have you tonight, and you may not know, but we have added Ernie Pyle to our museum. We have a mural on World War II, D-Day, as you know, better than most of us. He landed on D+1, and he was right in the thick of things like you're going to talk about in North Africa. And I think we spoke earlier, as a child, I lived on the island of Okinawa, Japan for 5 years, and unfortunately we know that that's where Ernie Pyle lost his life. And so without any further ado, I'm going to sign off. David, and the show is yours.
Thank you so much for having me. It's my great pleasure to be here. I'm so excited to talk to you about Ernie Pyle in North Africa, which, you know, because Ernie had such a prolific career as a war correspondent, like we heard, you know, he was at Omaha Beach, did a lot of reporting from Sicily and Italy that got a lot of attention, including the death of Captain Wascow, which some people say is the best thing that he ever wrote. You know, right after Paris was liberated in 1944, Ernie decides to pack it up and head back home. He had seen enough of war at that point, but for some reason, the thrill of going back into it was too much for him to say no to, and he ended up going to the Pacific, where he was killed in Okinawa. But tonight we're going to be focusing on his earliest days as a war correspondent, really, honestly, before he saw himself as a war correspondent. When he decided to go follow the troops to North Africa, he had plans to stick around in Algeria, Tunisia for a few months, do some reporting, and then head to India or China, sub-Saharan Africa. Before the war, Ernie was a roving correspondent, so he traveled all over the place and crisscrossed the United States and traveled all over North and South America. And so he was thinking of doing that, except in Africa and Southeast Asia. But there was something about spending time with the frontline troops in North Africa that inspired him to stick with them and to see it through as far as he could. So tonight we're going to look at the kinds of stories that Ernie told and his evolution as a writer, and also a little bit about my journey to retrace the steps that Ernie took from England to North Africa, Sicily, Italy, then France, and then to the Pacific. So my journey in North Africa started right here. This is Djebel Hamra, which is this jagged, steep-sloped escarpment that juts out of the desert valley near a very small town in central Tunisia called Sidi Bou Zid. And this is, Djebel Hamra is a mountain that Ernie climbed in February 1943 with some other war correspondents and some military officers to observe a tank battle that was going to happen in the city of Sidi Bou Zid. And so they scaled this mountain, and he writes about the experience of being at the top and seeing the American forces coming in to counterattack the Germans. The German 10th and 21st Panzer divisions had kind of screamed across central Tunisia and overran Allied defenses and was taking over this little city. And the plan was to turn them back there. But what ended up happening was that there were about 200 German tanks, half-tracks, and guns outside Sidi Bou Zid. And the Americans decided to counterattack with a single tank battalion, a tank destroyer company, an infantry battalion, and then some assorted artillery pieces. And there was a line that Ernie wrote from the top of the mountain where he says that an officer told him, "We're going to kick hell out of them today, and that we've got the stuff to do it." And later in the dispatch, Ernie wrote that, "Unfortunately, we didn't kick hell out of them. In fact, the boot was on the other foot." And there was this really horrendous tank battle that took there that wiped out most of the American forces there, and was really Ernie's first taste of like frontline combat. And so to recreate, to retrace Ernie's steps, I knew that I had to climb this mountain. Now, when I decided to go to Tunisia, I have a friend who works for Amnesty International, and he does lots of research in Africa. And he told me, okay, if you're going to go to North Africa, you really need a guide. There not a lot of people speak English. You're, a 6'4" white guy from Wisconsin. You're going to stand out. you don't know all the rules, you don't know the language, you got to find a guide. And I was lucky that I have a colleague of mine who's a professor in France, and she had a student who was Tunisian, and her father was a diplomat, and she spoke French and Arabic and English, and her name was Yamna, and she became my guide. Her cousin Zachariah became my driver, and for a week and a half, they came along with me to help retrace Ernie's steps. So we found Djebel Hamra, and the plan was to climb it, but Yamna was really concerned about any mountain in central Tunisia, because ever since 2010, 2011, in the wake of the Arab Spring, there have been insurgents and ISIS fighters that hide in the mountains in central Tunisia. And in fact, only a few months before I went to Tunisia, there was a Tunisian soldier that was killed by a IED that was planted in a mountain near Kasserine, which we'll talk about in a minute. And there had been other assorted incidents of firefights and explosions and different skirmishes in recent months. And so Yamna was really concerned that, we had to make sure that the mountain was safe before we decided to climb it. And she thought the best way to do that was to find someone local who could let us know what was going on. And as we were driving past the mountain here, we saw these farmers out in their onion field, and they were picking, or they were planting, I should say. And Yamna decided to pull over and go talk to these people and ask them what was going on. So we're crossing the road, jumping over this. This is you can see in the picture, there's a petroleum pipe and a water pipe. And we sort of made our way across the field. And it turned out that it was a husband and wife. The man was wearing this dingy white scarf, and it was wrapped loosely around his head. And he was wearing this baggy black suit jacket and pants. And the earth, I remember, had like worked into his pores and under his nails. And when we shook hands, his hand was cold from the cold ground. His wife stood behind him. She had this colorful scarf that looked handmade, and honestly was like too nice to be worn while planting. And the thing that sticks with me in my memory of them is how sort of weathered they were. But their eyes were kind and a little bit watery because it was windy that day. And so after I had exhausted my conversational French, which didn't take that long, Yamna spoke to them in a Tunisian dialect of Arabic, which is like a mix of Berber, Arabic, and French words, and told them about my project and how I was writing this book about a man who had watched a tank battle between the Americans and the Germans from the Red Mountain. So Djebel Hamra means the Red Mountain. And the woman said, "You mean the Black Mountain?" as she was pointing to it in the distance. And I looked to my map that I had brought from 1943. It was a military map, and it said Djebel Hamra. And so I said, is my map wrong, or is this the wrong place? And the woman said, "No, we just call it Black Mountain because it's not red." essentially. So once we started, we got on the same page about that. She was telling the people what I wanted to do, which was to climb the mountain. And the man spoke to Yamna, my translator, and he wanted to know what Ernie looked like. And so I said he was a small man, and I held my hand kind of flat against my sternum to show that he was shorter, much shorter than I was, and that he was about 110 pounds. He was 42 years old at the time, and he had thinning white hair on the top of his head, a big nose. And Yamna translated, and the man, like his brow furrowed, and he almost looked like he wanted to like comfort me, and he put his hand on my shoulder, and he said something to Yamna, and Yamna looked at me and she smiled and she said, he says your friend is not there anymore. And it was this really great moment of, you know, so much about Tunisia has really like remained constant. And so when we climbed to the top of the mountain, we essentially saw the same scene that Ernie saw at that time. So if you look at the picture over my shoulder in the distance, you can see kind of white stucco buildings. That's the town of Sidi Bou Zid. And in between the town and the mountain is where the American forces met with the Germans. So this was a really great vantage point to see the battle from. But all of the like irrigation ditches and the olive groves and the farm fields and like all of that stuff looks pretty much the same as it did in 1943. And so much of the life of the Tunisian people has remained similar to what it was in 1943. So it's a lot of farmers. Yamna's family is from that area, and they are farmers. They grow apples and olives, and they make really delicious olive oil, lots of different vegetables, peppers, that sort of thing. And there just seemed to be this like strange disconnect with whoever I talked to while I was there about, well, why are you coming here to see a place that somebody saw, you know, 77 years ago? Like, what's the point of doing that? And the thing I kept coming back to was that in Ernie's writing, there were a few things that he did pretty consistently. And one was he painted these really vivid pictures of the places that he went. And, you know, I think that comes from his background as a travel writer, but I think it was also a very purposeful strategy to try to help the American reader, and Ernie called them the folks at home, to be able to picture what the places looked like where their sons and their fathers and, you know, their relatives were. And so in his columns, he always had these long, beautiful descriptions of the land and the places and the people. But mostly his focus was on the soldier, right? And that's what he was there to do. He didn't spend a lot of time talking to the people, the Arab people who lived in Tunisia, or the Sicilian people, or the Italian people. And a lot of that was because, you know, he didn't speak those languages, but also because, you know, we were at war against the Italians, and it wasn't always clear on the ground if the Arabs, Berbers living in Tunisia were aligned with the Germans or if they were aligned with the French. And so there was kind of a need to keep everyone at a distance. And what I wanted to be able to do was to see how did the battle impact the people that lived there, and what were some of the lasting effects of the North African campaign. How did it shape this place? And because I felt like that's something that Ernie would have liked to have been able to write about. But I also just wanted to be able to see the things that he was writing about, to see how much they had changed or if they had changed at all. And so when we got to the top of the mountain, this was really the first time that I felt like in my travels, I knew that I had been to a place that Ernie for sure had been to. You know, I could say like, oh, I was in this town, but I didn't know exactly where in the town Ernie was. That wasn't the case here. I knew he was at the top of this mountain, and that what I saw is very similar to what he saw. The way that Ernie described central Tunisia was that it looked like the high plains of the American Southwest, which was the place that was sort of his second home. He grew up in Indiana, but he bought a house in New Mexico and loved that part of the country. And so maybe it was a little bit easier for him to put those things into words. So from the top of the mountain, it's February 15th, 1943. Ernie's sitting there, probably doesn't have a notebook out like I do in the picture, just because he very rarely ever took notes. He just had a memory for details. I've read a couple of accounts that like really the only thing he ever wrote down was maybe the spelling of someone's last name or an address that he was afraid he'd forget. But otherwise, he really just immersed himself in the scene and tried to remember all of the sensory details that came to him, the smells, the sights, the sensations, all of those different things. So it's February 15th. He's at the top of this mountain. And all of a sudden, a battalion commander's voice crackles to life over the radio. And Ernie hears the commander say, "We're on the edge of Sidi Bou Zid and have struck no opposition yet." And across the parched plain between the mountain and the city were about 40 American tanks and a dozen tank destroyers. And blue smoke was pouring out of their exhaust. And Ernie said that the sky was a sand-dusted color. And as they were approaching the city, Ernie wrote that the peaceful report from our tank charge brought no comment from anyone around the command truck. Faces were grave. It wasn't right. The business of no opposition at all. There must be a trick in it somewhere. And that's exactly what happened. So the Germans really kind of let the American forces into this very classic tank attack ambush and really just wiped out the forces that were there. Ernie had some binoculars. He said that the muzzle flashes blinked like Christmas lights. And then from far off came the sound of explosions. And it was just, the German artillery was just ripping to shreds the forces that were trying to attack. And they really held nothing back. I mean, the Stukas were dive bombing and strafing, and Panzer tanks were firing armor-piercing rounds, and mortars were going off, and machine guns, and it was a real mess. And so the general who was in charge of that attack, his last name was McQuillan, he wrote in his diary later that as dusk began to settle, the sunset showed red, and the dust, red on the dust of the Sidi Bou Zid area. There was no wind, and the frequent black smoke pillars scattered over the terrain marked locations of burning tanks. And so this was a pretty devastating thing to watch. Here's a map of the battle, and you can see in the sort of middle of the image towards the top is Sidi Bou Zid, and then there's kind of a highway that goes to the north of that. And the mountain that I climbed was kind of up here in this section of sort of the top middle overlooking the city. And you know, in hindsight, things you know, appear like the American forces just sort of ran right into a trap. And I've read some interesting analysis of the Army staff that were sent to kind of learn what happened about the battle, and they were counting all of the bullet holes and artillery damage and shell damage on the tanks. And they found that the tanks were not, they didn't have any frontal damage. It was all from the sides and the rear, which meant that the tanks had sort of come in and were surrounded from the sides. And there's one picture I found as I was doing this research that I think sums up pretty well what things look like. So this Sherman tank that was destroyed by an explosion, what ended up happening apparently was that this tank was hit by an enemy round, and the round ignited the tank rounds that were in the tank, and the turret exploded off the top and then fell so that the barrel of the tank fell into this hole that the tank driver would have come in and out of. So it was a pretty devastating loss. The figures from that battle show that the Americans lost 46 tanks that day, along with 15 officers and 298 men that were either killed, captured, or missing. So it was pretty rough. And after the battle, Ernie found himself in this kind of this area where people were sort of coming back to regroup. And he wrote some pretty eloquent stuff about just how beat up everyone was, and how, you know, everyone had a story of impossible survival. This was a picture of 3 guys that made their way out, and I was just so struck seeing this picture of the guy in the passenger seat. You know, his shirt's just ripped to shreds, and you can tell by their caps that they were tankers, those like tight skin caps. So it looks like these guys must have gotten out of their tank and before it was completely destroyed. So at that point, you know, the Germans have really beat the hell out of the Americans, and the Americans start retreating westward towards Kasserine. And if you're any kind of a World War II history buff, you've definitely heard of the battle for Kasserine Pass, which was really a debacle for the Americans. And Ernie's a part of that retreat, but he writes about it in a way that's kind of curious. So he writes about it, and he says things like, it didn't look like a retreat. It was very ordered. You know, everyone was in high spirits. You know, he really tries to sort of put a very positive spin on what's happening. And in subsequent years, you know, in years after World War II, especially during the Vietnam War era, Ernie started to take a little flack from journalists, war correspondents, you know, people in the media who looked back on his reporting from this time and thought that, you know, he was really more of a propagandist than a war correspondent, right? That he was telling stories that weren't true because he was trying to sort of help the military keep up the spirits of the people back home. And there's some really interesting writing that's been done on this since the end of the war. And one of my very favorite ways of, I think, making sense of this comes from John Steinbeck, who, you know, a lot of people don't know. He worked as a war correspondent during World War II for the New York Herald Tribune. And the way that he described being a war correspondent, he said that we edited ourselves much more than we were edited. We felt responsible to what was called the home front. There was a general feeling that unless the home front was carefully protected from the whole account of war, of what war was like, it might panic. And so in that sense, you know, Steinbeck is he's making this argument that like censoring himself was a patriotic duty, and that it's, you know, it's possible that Ernie felt the same way. He definitely wanted the Allies to win, right? He didn't want to do anything that would negatively affect people at home or make them defeatist or, you know, anything like that. But there was another part of this that, you know, is something we have to take account of, which is that the war correspondents were also censored by the military. And not only was their writing censored, but they also totally depended on the military for supplies, for transportation, for food, for protection. So if you upset military censors, you were gone. And there was a very delicate dance that that the writers, the war correspondents had to do with the censors. And in fact, one of the lines that Ernie wrote in the first draft of his columns about the tank battle, he wrote that never were so few commanded so badly by so many. And the censors cut that out. And so what he did instead was talk about the retreat, but make it clear that, yes, we were losing, but we turned it around and things worked out. And that's probably not something that that he knew was going to happen. It was definitely wishful thinking at the time. But like Steinbeck said, you know, they were part of the war effort, and it was their job not to interfere with the messaging that they were convinced you know, people needed to be told certain things. And one of my favorite quotes from Steinbeck about this topic is he says that it's in the things not mentioned that the untruth lies. So it wasn't necessarily that the correspondents were lying, certainly putting spin on things, but it was the things that they didn't talk about where a lot of the untruth was located. So when Ernie wrote about the retreat, it definitely brought a certain credibility that maybe other correspondents that were in the back of the front lines with the officers and with the headquarters staff didn't necessarily have that same level of credibility. I mean, Ernie was living with the soldiers on the front lines, digging foxholes, digging slit trenches, sleeping in tents, eating sea rations. And so for him to say that, the folks at home should feel no shame or be concerned about what's happening, that, America and its soldiers are going to win, that their fighting spirit is good, their morale is high, they're going to keep fighting, they're going to keep learning, they're going to keep getting better. That did have a lot of impact on people. And they began to see the war through Ernie's eyes. Now, after the retreat, the soldiers are trying to get through Kasserine Pass, and the plan becomes to sort of make that the last stand. There's going to be a battle between the Germans and the Americans in the Kasserine Pass, but that this is sort of the place where America soldiers are going to take their stand and they're going to turn back the Germans. And it just so happened that Yamna's family's land is Kasserine Pass. And so I got to have this just incredible tour of the property from Yamna, she's the young lady with the tan longer coat there. And this is the other gentleman in the picture is her uncle Rabe. And their family owned all of the land in Kasserine Pass, and sort of in front of it towards the city of Kasserine, and also behind it towards the Algerian border. And the pass is this very narrow, flat piece of ground that's between these two different mountains. One is called Djebel Sammama and one is Djebel Sammama. And Sammama is on the north side of the pass, Chambi is on the south side. And Chambi is the tallest point in Tunisia. It's a 4,300 foot summit. And a few months before I got there, there was some fighting between insurgents and Tunisian military forces on Djebel Sammama, like right, within view of where Yamna's family lives. And so what you're seeing in the picture here, all these rocks strewn about on top of this hill, this was the family compound that was destroyed during the battle. And Yamna told me this great story about how her family, because they were landowners and they were olive farmers, had quite a bit of money in comparison to their other to their neighbors. And so her grandfather had built this compound that had this big open area in the middle, and then there were all these different kind of separate, smaller areas along the middle where the different families would live. And so this was like the extended family, all lived in the same compound, all the brothers and sisters and their families. And Yamna's grandfather was the head of the family. And she said that he, as like a sign of his wealth, decided to mix olive oil into the mortar when they built the compound. I don't know that added any structural integrity, but it certainly was expensive. Well, during the battle, the compound was destroyed, and some members of Yamna's family were killed as well. And there were also places, little river gulches, and under a bridge where Yamna's family hid during the fighting. And most survived, which was great, but it was definitely devastating for them to find that their family home had been destroyed. Now, I asked Yamna why it was never rebuilt, and she said that their family never knew who destroyed it, whether it was the Americans or the Germans, and so they never knew who to appeal for reparations. And so when I was doing some research on the battle, I can't prove it, obviously, but my speculation is that it was the Germans that destroyed it, because it was this battle where the Germans used a weapon that they had never used before, which was called the Nebelwerfer. And basically it has 6 barrels, and it fires these huge mortar rounds that each weigh 75 pounds. And these are what the Americans called screaming Mimis. And they called them that because as they were flying through the air, it sounded like a woman crying. And that the Germans would have been incentivized to destroy the compound because they ended up holding the high ground on Mount Chambi and also the ridgeline below Sammama. So they really had the Americans kind of, again, had superior advantage in terms of positioning over the Americans that were all dug in on this very flat valley in between the two mountains. And so I could imagine a German commander saying, take out that compound. That's, a place where the Americans could be hiding. Let's get it off the battle space. But again, I can't prove that for sure, and I haven't been able to find any evidence one way or the other. So while I was getting this tour of the land, Yamna asked me what Ernie was doing during all of this, and what I found was that he, was with the forces that retreated through Kasserine Pass. But then, as the Germans were approaching, Ernie took a Jeep and drove all the way back to a port city in Algeria. It was about 18 hours drive so that he could write his columns. And part of me wonders if he was a little bit nervous about the Americans' prospects for winning the battle. And it's definitely possible that he was just making sure he wasn't there for that part of it. Here's another image. The one on top is obviously a piece of military equipment that was destroyed. You can see on the top there's kind of this like wavy ridge. That's Sammama, and in the picture on the bottom is what it looks like today. So the valley between the two mountains is now covered in prickly pear, and they are very sharp. I can attest to that. Now, yes, it was, the Americans were in a really rough spot during the battle, but they were fortunate that the Germans kind of didn't know what to do next. They didn't think they were going to have such success and push the Americans 50 miles in retreat. And so Rommel, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who was leading the Germans, faltered. He didn't make a decision. He wanted to make a decision to attack through Kasserine Pass, but he had to wait for orders. And when the orders finally came, the orders were to divide his forces and send half through Kasserine Pass and send the other half farther north to another mountain pass. And then the plan was whichever mountain pass was defended less strongly, then that would be the one that they would go through. Well, that allowed, splitting your forces is rarely a good idea. And that allowed the Americans to lay a bunch of mines in the other mountain pass and sort of divide and conquer the forces enough to where Rommel started running out of supplies and had to retreat back across central Tunisia. And so in their wake, though, they ended up leaving thousands and thousands and thousands of mines, anti-personnel mines, and 43,000 actually. And so this is the train station in Kasserine, and it actually looks just like that still today, except the doors and the window frames are blue, and there's not as much traffic on the train lines as there used to be. But in the years since World War II, lots of the mines have never been dug up and deactivated. And every year there are, a dozen or so people who are wounded or killed, usually in very rural areas where people are working as shepherds or farmers. A lot of children have been hurt and killed by that as well. But it's this moment where, the Americans, in Ernie's telling of the North African campaign, this is kind of the moment where, we've been kicked on our butt, and now it's the moment to either do or die, right? And another World War II vet and writer, Kurt Vonnegut, has a name for stories like these, and he calls them the man in the hole story. So you have a man who's not in a hole, and then he falls in a hole, and now he has to figure out how to get out of the hole. Well, Kasserine Pass was America in the hole, and now it was a matter of getting out and figuring out what to do next. Now, after he wrote up those columns on the tank battle and the retreat, Ernie took a trip to sub-Saharan Africa and just wanted to warm up and change the scenery. And there he followed, he did a little writing on the cargo planes and the support soldiers that were in sub-Saharan Africa, shuttling cargo to the Middle East and to North Africa. And when he returned, the Americans had sort of figured out what had gone wrong, and the general who was in charge of the forces during the Battle of Kasserine Pass was removed, and Eisenhower puts George Patton in charge in North Africa. And immediately there's this sort of change in culture and demeanor and discipline and attitude, and the Americans start kicking some German butt, out of central Tunisia. And the path to victory looked like this. And this is a zoomed in image of this really beautiful mosaic that depicts the entire North African campaign that I saw at the North African American Cemetery, which we'll talk about in a second. But I think it does a nice job of showing exactly how the tables turned in the spring of 1943. And it was the soldiers from the 34th and the 9th and the 1st Infantry Division that were tasked with pushing the Germans back towards the sea to Tunis and the port city of Bizerte, which is at the very top of Tunisia. And this is where Ernie comes back into the picture. So he's had his time away from the front, and now he's going in to see what's changed and how has the fighting changed the men on the ground. And so things were definitely different because the Americans and the Allies had finally gotten their supply lines figured out. They had overwhelming force. They had a heavy preponderance of not only men, but tanks and planes and ammunition and everything else. And the Axis forces, primarily German, but also Italian, were starting to deplete themselves. And they didn't have much supplies left, but they did have the high ground. And so the big difference between central Tunisia and northern Tunisia, central Tunisia is very flat, very arid. Northern Tunisia is very mountainous and very lush and green, and a little bit more what you'd imagine, I think, of kind of a Mediterranean climate. And the Germans knew that with those capturing the high ground, like it was going to be a bloody path to victory. For the Americans and for the Allies. They were going to have to root them out as they went, as they pushed them towards Bizerte and Tunis. So the way that Ernie described northern Tunisia has really stuck with me. He wrote that the North Country was entirely different from the central part of the country. And he says, in the north, the land was fertile and everything was violently green. Northern Tunisia was all hills and valleys. There were no trees at all. But there in the spring, the earth was solidly covered with deep green pastures and freshly growing fields of grain. Small wildflowers splattered the countryside. I never saw a lovelier or more gentle country. It gave a sense of peacefulness. It seemed to speak its richness. It was a full, ripe country, and there in the springtime, living seemed sweet and worthwhile. And then a few sentences later, right, he's just built this image of how beautiful and lovely everything is. And a few sentences later, he says, yet that peaceful green was gradually turned red with blood. The roads were packed with brown painted convoys, and the trailers sprouted long rifle barrels. The incredibly blue sky with its big white clouds was streaked with warplanes in great throbbing formations. And before long, the whole northeastern corner of Tunisia roared and raged with a violence utterly out of character with a landscape so rich in natures. And so this was like just classic Pyle technique, which was to juxtapose this very beautiful, serene image with the violence and the destruction that man was bringing to the area. And not only did he see a change in the scenery, but he also saw a change in the men who were doing the fighting. And he writes of the men that that spring I was away from the front lines for a while, living with other troops, and considerable fighting took place while I was gone. When I got ready to return to my old friends at the front, I wondered if I would sense any change in them. I did, and definitely. The most vivid change was the casual and workshop manner in which they talked about killing. They had made the psychological transition from their normal belief that taking human life was sinful over to a new professional outlook where killing was a craft. No longer was there anything morally wrong about killing. In fact, it was an admirable thing. And this is where he says that America's fighting men really had their blood was finally up. And that this fighting life that they were living killing was seen as a profession in the same way that writing was for Ernie. And it was the 1st Infantry Division specifically that Ernie wrote about at this time, because he spent about 3 months with different elements of the 1st Infantry Division. And he said of the division that they were an example of what our American units could do after they had gone through the mill of experience. Right? So Ernie's starting to tell this story of, okay, we had to get a little bloodied at Kasserine Pass to learn our lessons, take our lumps, cut our teeth, whatever, however you want to put that. And that now, because we had learned these lessons, now the tide was turning. The Germans were going to lose. And he says of the 1st Infantry soldiers, those boys did themselves proud. Everybody spoke about it. Our casualties included few taken prisoners. He makes very clear to say nobody surrendered. All the other casualties were wounded or they died fighting, that they were brave. And one general told Ernie that the men in the 1st Infantry Division never gave an inch. They died right in their foxholes. And actually the title for Ernie's second book comes from this scene where he's with a British general who's serving a battlefield in northern Tunisia after the fighting had ended, and sees, men dead, clearly having fought to the death. And he says, brave men, brave men. And that's the title that Ernie used for his second collection of wartime columns. Now, the other thing that Ernie's doing at this time, he's not just telling the story, the redemption story of the American military, but he's also trying to give a better sense of what life is like on the front lines without necessarily getting into all the bloody, gory details, which is something that the censors would not have allowed, and probably his readers back home would not have appreciated. And so one of the ways that he does this is he gives these really poetic descriptions of what life is like at the front. And one that's really stuck with me has to do with the artillery shells firing all night long from both the American lines and the German lines. And what he writes is that dusk came on, and with dusk began the steady boom of big guns in the mountains ahead of us. They weren't near enough for the sound to be crashing. Rather, it was like the lonely roll of an approaching thunderstorm, a sound which since childhood has always made me sad with a kind of portent of inevitable doom. And he calls the sounds that are made by the artillery concussion ghosts. And he says that they travel in waves and that they touch our tent walls and they make the walls quiver. He says that ghosts were shaking the ground ever so lightly. Ghosts were stirring the dogs to hysteria. Ghosts were wandering in the sky, peering for us, cringing in our hideouts. Ghosts were everywhere, and their hordes were multiplying as every hour added its production of new battlefield dead. And then the line that really sticks with me, he finishes this description by saying, we lay and thought of the graveyards and the dirty men and the shocking blast of the big guns, and we couldn't sleep. On some nights, he continued, the air became sick, and there was an unspoken contagion of spiritual dread, and we were little boys again, lost in the dark. And that was what Ernie did so well, was he told these very honest stories about life at the front without upsetting the military censors and without making people at home feel fatalistic or feel like the Allies aren't going to prevail. And I think he did that in a way that was not only beautiful, but very effective too. And so by the time that Ernie is getting ready to land at Omaha Beach, he finds out that he's been awarded the Pulitzer Prize for his reporting. And a lot of people think, oh, he got that, Captain Moscow, Italy campaign, that was so beautiful. But he really was awarded the Pulitzer for his reporting from North Africa. And this was really when his readership started increasing. New papers every week were deciding to run his column. At the height of his popularity, Ernie had 14 million daily readers. 14 million. I don't know if anybody can even say that today, and the country's twice as big. I don't know if anybody can say that they have 14 million people every day reading their column. And Ernie wrote 6 columns a week, which is astounding. As a writer, it's hard for me to imagine that kind of output. The other thing that Ernie does really well is he talks about the fighting in a way that's sort of very high level, but makes it clear that it's pretty awful and that the men who are surviving it are going to be affected by what they survive. So one thing he says about the fighting that the 1st Infantry Division is doing in the mountains in that final phase of the campaign is he says that it was a war of such intensity as Americans on this side of the ocean had ever known. It was a battle without let up. It was a war of drenching artillery and hidden mines and walls of machine gun fire and even the barbaric bayonet. It was exhausting, it was cruel, last-ditch kind of war, and those who went through it would seriously doubt that war could be any worse. And so again, he's doing lots of telling of what's going on without getting into too many details, but he's using different writing techniques and different kinds of details to still give a sense of what the soldiers are really going through. And as the Allies are getting closer and closer to Tunis and Bizerte, the Allied bombers are starting to level Bizerte because it was the port city where the Germans were bringing in most of their supplies. And Ernie writes about this as well, that by early May, Bizerte had been completely wrecked. And there's some research soon after the campaign ended that there wasn't a single hospitable building in the entire city. And specifically, Ernie writes that Bizerte was a large city and a beautiful one. It is impossible to picture in words what it looked like after its destruction. If you remember World War I pictures of such places as Verdun, that was the way it was. Again, he's trying to paint a picture that his readers are going to be able to see in their mind's eye. And he goes on to say that nothing could possibly have lived through the months-long bombing of Bizerte those who say a city can't be destroyed by bombing should go and see Bizerte. Now, luckily, most of the Tunisians that were, and lots of French Tunisians that were living in Bizerte had left before the bombing started. I haven't been able to find any good records of what kind of civilian casualties they were. Some estimates say that over the course of the entire campaign in Tunisia, about 8,000 Tunisian civilians were killed, either in bombings or crossfire, that sort of thing. But another thing that was going on was extrajudicial punishments that the French forces inflicted on Tunisians because there was a fear as the Germans were surrendering and the Allies were taking over. There was a fear that the Tunisians would want independence from the French. Tunisia had been a French colony. And so some of the French forces that were following behind the American and British were rounding up people, anyone who had been or who could be credibly accused of helping the Germans or of looting or of serving as a spy in some capacity. There's some evidence that shows the French were sort of looking for political people who participated in politics who might be revolutionaries if given the chance, and executing them. In fact, one of Yamna's family members had been summarily executed in Kasserine a couple of days after the battle ended because he was accused of being a supporter of the Germans. And then after he was executed, the paper in Kasserine ran an article saying that the accusations had been unfounded and that it was this tragic loss. But Yamna thinks it had a lot to do with her family members' political leanings, that he would have been a member of the Tunisian resistance if there had been one. And especially like accusing the Tunisians of helping the Germans is kind of a funny concept, considering that like the Vichy French were aligned with the Germans and that we had to fight the French when we landed in Algeria before they surrendered and then, became part of the Allied side. So there's a very complicated history of occupation and imperialism and revolution that takes place during the North African campaign and then afterwards, and eventually results in Tunisia gaining its independence. But that's a whole other talk for sure. So when I visited Bizerte, you can see there's kind of like a little water canal in the middle of the picture. So I went back there and here's what it looks like today. There's still little fishing boats. There's lots of kind of hodgepodge construction. Some stuff you can tell is, was built soon after the war or was, repaired. Other stuff is more new. It's still, a fairly impoverished area compared to other big cities in the Mediterranean. But it's really quite a beautiful city. And I had some really, really tasty baked fish while I was there. I got to meet a journalist who covered politics in Bizerte, and he bought me this really wonderful lunch and told me all about his work and the history of the city. And so my last stop while I was in Tunisia was at the American Cemetery in North Africa, it's in Carthage and it's right outside Tunis. And it felt like this was a fitting place to end the talk tonight because this was, the final resting ground for so many soldiers that fought and sailors and pilots and, there's lots of obviously different branches covered here, but lots of 1st Infantry Division are buried there. I learned that after the war, families had the option of bringing their loved ones' remains back to the United States, or they could be buried in a military cemetery like this. And about 27 acres worth of headstones are there today and are kept in really immaculate shape by a pretty substantial crew of people who, you know, make sure that those who are fallen are honored every day. And this, as I was looking at these headstones, I kept thinking about this line that Ernie had written about the North African campaign, that at the end, when he was reflecting back on, you know, the man in the whole story and this redemption story, he said that the men of the 1st Infantry Division fought like veterans. They were well handled. They had enough of what they needed. Everything meshed perfectly, and the end was inevitable. We need never be ashamed of our American fighters, even though they didn't do too well in the beginning. There was never at any time any question about the Americans' bravery. It was a matter of being hardened and practiced by going through the flames. And he confesses that there were times when he felt like the Americans were going to lose the war, but that by the end of the North African campaign, he no longer felt that way. And so if we think about Ernie's writing as, you know, there's this high level story, right? And I've described it as the man in the whole story, where the Americans land, they're feeling very confident, they're bloodied at Kasserine Pass, they pull themselves up by their bootstraps, and they turn the tide of the battle, and eventually, you know, turn the tide of the entire war. That's the story. But in Ernie's writing, there's always a story underneath the story. And what I think Ernie was trying to say in lots of his writing, especially from North Africa, was that yes, it was good that we were winning and that things were turning around and we were figuring things out, but that the cost of this fighting was going to be very high, not just in terms of the men who were killed, but also those that were going to be forever changed. And one thing that he wrote about the survivors of North Africa is that he said, our men can't make this change from normal civilians into warriors and remain the same people. Even if they were away from you this long under normal circumstances, the mere process of maturing would change them and they would not come home just as you knew them. Add to that the abnormal world they have been plunged into, the new philosophies they have had to assume or perish inwardly, the horrors and delights and strange, wonderful things they have experienced, and they are bound to be different people from those you sent away. They are rougher than when you knew them, because killing is a rough business. He says that the transition back to normal days will be as difficult for many as was the change into war, and some will never be able to accomplish it. And that's the thing that has really stuck with me, not just from the American side, right? That veterans are going to feel this way, but that the people living in Tunisia as well, Yamna and her family, are going to have the same kind of burdens, and that trauma can reverberate through generations. And I know that's been true for my family, and I'm sure that's been true for others as well. So with that, Laura, I'm ready to.
Ready?
Questions. I saw a few came through already.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to jump straight into questions. First and foremost, since we don't have an audience with you physically, I want to give you a round of applause.
Oh,
thank you so much for your presentation. I do want to jump into questions. We have some good ones waiting for you. I do want to remind, I'm going to honor our end time of 8:15 today. So if I do not get to your question, I apologize. And please visit David's website, davidchrissinger.com. His email is available, and he's happy to answer any questions that I don't get to this evening. But let's jump into it, because there's some great questions here I've been dying to ask you. So the first one is, this visitor or this guest was in Hawaii at the Punch Bowl Cemetery where Ernie Pyle is buried. And while he was there, he saw someone sitting at the grave. And the person they were with said that that's Ernie Pyle's grave and someone is there every day. Do you know anything about this? Is this true?
I have not heard that, but it honestly wouldn't surprise me. There's actually a pretty interesting chain of events that happen after Ernie's killed. And so, he was killed in Okinawa. He was actually killed in this very small island off the northwest coast of Okinawa. And he was initially buried there in a temporary cemetery alongside soldiers that had been killed. And then after the battle ended, there are no Americans buried at Okinawa now. Formally, I'm sure there are remains and that sort of thing, but those bodies were disinterred, either brought all the way back to the United States or they were buried in Hawaii. And there was a really big clamoring of people who wanted to have Ernie's body brought back to Indiana and then set up like this big Ernie Pyle Memorial Museum, Visitors Center, kind of a thing where people could pilgrimage to see him. And his wife did not like that idea at all and like put her foot down and said that Ernie would have never wanted that. He would have never wanted that much fanfare. He would want to be buried with that he was with that, when he was overseas. And so it's just a very simple marker. But it honestly wouldn't surprise me if someone was there. I don't know if every day, but just because his memory is so alive for so many people. I mean, when I wrote the article about Ernie for the 75th anniversary of D-Day for the New York Times, I had this idea that I wanted to write a book about him, and my agent said, "Do you think anybody like remembers Ernie Pyle?" And I said, "Yeah, I swear they do, right?" And he was like, "Well, why don't we test out, like write an article about him, see what kind of reaction it gets, and then if the article does well, we can use that as a justification for why we want to do the book." And when the article came out in the New York Times, it had 1 million views in the first. I mean, it just exploded, and I got hundreds of emails from people who had some kind of connection to Ernie. So again, it wouldn't surprise me, but I don't know for sure. I was supposed to be in Hawaii this summer, but COVID happened. But now when I do go, fingers crossed, in the next few months or year, who knows, I will look into that, and maybe that'll be a good newsletter.
Please. And if you haven't read David's New York Times article that he wrote for the 75th anniversary of D-Day, I highly suggest getting on New York Times and looking that up. It's a wonderful article. But while we're on the topic, we have another guest. His name is Gregory, and his father was with Ernie Pyle when his father was with the 77th Division when Ernie Pyle was killed. And he said that they commemorated him with a monument there, but he was later buried at Punch Bowl. So I want to say, Gregory, thank you so much for your father's service and sharing that story with us this evening. But Gregory's question is did Ernie Pyle's Pacific campaign reporting reflect war weariness, or did it seem different from his writings when he was writing in the early year?
Honestly, I think it reflected his war weariness, for sure. So some of his early reporting from the Pacific was, there's always rivalries, right, between different branches. And Ernie had spent all of his time with the Army, right? And then all of a sudden he's on a ship in the Pacific with the Navy, and he's listening to the sailors' stories, and they're telling him about how hard it is to be a sailor. And Ernie's kind of going like, "Oh, come on, guys. You're on a ship. You get 3 hot meals a day. You get to sleep in a rack, right? You're not living in a foxhole. You're not doing half of what the guys in Europe are doing." And that really made the Navy upset because the Navy took its lumps in the Pacific. That was not an easy gig to be on a ship, but he had this kind of I don't want to call it self-righteous, but a little bit like, you guys don't know how rough it really is on the other side of the world. So that kind of annoyed some of his military fans, annoyed the Navy a little bit. He also writes about using some pretty like xenophobic, racist language about the Japanese, which, I think was that he was a product of his time. He wasn't writing anything about the Japanese that everyone else wasn't writing. You could tell that there was definitely a hatred towards the Japanese that he didn't use when writing about the Germans. And again, I think that could be some evidence of combat fatigue, war weariness. But once he gets onto Okinawa, his writing from Okinawa is like he's right back in his rhythm because he's on the front lines and that's what he knows how to do. So it's a little bit like, I think it took him some time to figure out his voice, and then he was killed, and it, you know, happened.
Yeah.
But there was a column that was found in his pocket the day he was killed, that is like gut-wrenchingly beautiful. And the journalism school for Indiana University published a copy of it on their website, and I reference it in the New York Times article as well. But you could tell that, you know, he was definitely ready to tell the story of the real reality that he hadn't been able to write fully about. He was ready to do that when the war ended, and then he was killed.
Well, we have, I think we have time for 2 more questions. So this guest wanted to share that the story of Buck Eversole in Italy really moved him. Did Ernie ever see Buck Eversole again? And do you know anything about Eversole after the war?
Yeah, actually, so I write about Buck quite a bit in the book. So I won't give away all the details, but I can give you broad strokes. So Buck Eversole was a sergeant in, I forget which division he was in off the top of my head, but he met Ernie, and Ernie saw him as like the war hero, right? He had been in for the duration. I think he had 2 silver stars at the time that Ernie met him. He had been wounded a number of times, and he was one of the last men in his company that were the original, right? And he had basically survived because he was lucky and he was good. And Ernie really connected with him. They shared a foxhole for a few days. They talked pretty endlessly. Buck was also a little bit older than the average soldier, and he was from the Western United States. And so Ernie kind of connected with him, you know, being a little bit older, loving the Western United States. They had that in common. So Ernie convinced Buck's superiors that Buck needed to come with him to Naples for book research. And this was when Buck's unit was outside Cassino in central Italy, where Monte Cassino was. And his officers say, okay, Buck can go. Buck doesn't really want to go. He feels a little bit guilty about leaving his guys, but he also knows that, you know, he's been in combat for so long that he needs a break. And so he goes to Naples with Ernie, and Ernie just like shows him a great time, gives him, you know, takes him out to eat, gets them liquored up. They go to Pompeo and tour the ruins of Pompeo. And then Buck was eventually sent home because he came down with a really, really bad case of trench foot and was unable to walk. And he had already been wounded several times and had 2 silver stars, and they basically said, like, thank you for your service, you've done enough, we're sending you home. After the war, he became a police officer, and he died from a heart attack in the late 50s, early 60s.
And I want to add, one of our guests just typed in that they had been in contact with Eversole's widow and shared with us that he was a police officer. So thanks for sharing that with us. Let's get to our final question. I think this is actually a perfect question to end this evening with too. So given the numerous of other journalists that were covering the war and sending reports home, why do you believe that none of them are beloved as much as Ernie Pyle?
I think it has to do with the fact that Ernie did not care about the strategy of the war. So he would say that I never write the bird's eye view because I don't know anything about the bird's eye view. I write the worm's eye view because I'm in the mud. And he was one of the few journalists who, in a really compelling, really beautiful, really concise way, showed the folks at home what it was like to be in that place in that time. Whereas, you know, beat reporters, AP reporters, you know, people that were on deadline, they had to do the straight news. It was like, you know, the Americans invaded this town, they fought for this long, this many people were killed. Okay, now we're moving on to the next, right? It was very much a deadline. Ernie had a lot more freedom to write whatever he wanted to write. He was still on a deadline in the sense that he had to publish his columns every day, but he could write whatever he wanted. And he chose to tell those human interest stories in a time when nobody else was doing that. And by the time, 1944 comes around, people are trying to imitate him, right? They're trying to borrow his style, but he does it as well as Ernie does.
Yeah.
And the other thing that I think is, at least what I really love about his writing, is how honest it is in a way that builds connection instead of building distance, right? There are ways of telling really difficult truths in a way that makes people kind of go, "Oh, sorry I asked."
Yeah.
Right? Ernie told his stories in a way that it felt like a friend confiding in you. And so people felt like they knew Ernie. They felt like when they read his words, it was like having a conversation with someone they had known for a long time. And so anytime I think a writer can use their stories to build that kind of connection, they're going to have a lasting memory with their reader. And then we can't discount the fact that he was killed. He was murdered in that way, and that really catapulted him into legendary status because he wasn't there anymore. And so it's tragic and it's sad, but it's also, I think we'd be kidding ourselves if we didn't say that was part of the reason that people love him so much, was that, he told the story of the average soldier and then he died like an average soldier.
Well put. We have one more guest who just wanted to let you know, say thank you so much for your presentation this evening, and is really looking forward to reading your book, as am I. So thank you again, David. Just as a reminder to everybody that our next date with history is going to be this upcoming Thursday, September 24th. It is called An Evening Aboard the USS Missouri. We're going to be hearing from Neil Yamamoto. He is an educator aboard the battleship Missouri, and he is going to be sharing with us stories about the battleship Missouri near the end of World War II, leading up to the signing of the peace treaty. I'm really looking forward to that one too, so I hope you're able to join us for that. Have a wonderful evening, everybody, and hopefully we'll be able to see you again soon. Have a great evening. Thank you again, David.
Thank you.